I killed a man, slaughtered him, and ate him. Since then, he is always with me.
Armin Meiwes gained notoriety when his unsettling cannibalistic tale made headlines.
It tasted really good.
However, he isn't the only one with such a chilling story. Katherine Knight, for instance, made news in Australia after she killed her husband, cooked his body, and served it to their children. These are just a few of the 16 individuals who became infamous for consuming human flesh.
Number 16. Katherine Knight. Katherine Knight is a name that sends shivers down the spines of even the most hardened true crime enthusiasts. Born in 1955 in the small town of Tenterfield, New South Wales, Australia, Knight grew up in a turbulent environment. Her early life was marred by violence and abuse, which unfortunately foreshadowed the horrific events that would make her infamous. Fast forward to 2000, and Katherine Knight had already developed a reputation for violent behavior. But nothing could have prepared anyone for the gruesome crime she would commit.
This is one of the most distressing and disturbing murders ever committed in this country.
Knight was in a tumultuous relationship with John Price, a well-liked local miner. Their relationship, filled with violent arguments, took a deadly turn on the night of February 29, 2000. Knight waited until Price was asleep before launching her brutal attack. Armed with a butcher's knife, she stabbed Price at least 37 times, leaving him with no chance of survival. But the horror didn't stop there.
She stabbed him the whole way as he was running down the hallway to get outside.
Drawing on her experience from working in a slaughterhouse, Knight skinned Price's body with chilling precision, even hanging the skin on a meat hook in their home. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this macabre tale is what Knight did next. She decapitated Price and boiled his head in a pot, along with vegetables, as though she was preparing a stew. Knight also cooked his flesh, carving out portions from his body and arranging them on plates with vegetables like pumpkin, beetroot, zucchini, and potatoes. She set these plates on the dining table, next to handwritten notes bearing the names of Price's children. Knight's intention was terrifyingly clear. She planned to serve this grotesque meal to Price's children when they came home. Thankfully, the police intervened before she could serve this horrifying dish.
It could have been a fork, a spoon, or anything in my hand. It was a knife that cut your meal with.
Knight was arrested and in 2001 became the first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The crime scene was so horrifying that it led some police officers to quit their jobs, while others reportedly swore off eating meat for months.
There was never a sign on her face of any reaction to any of the evidence.
Number 15. Armin Meiwes. Armin Meiwes, known infamously as the Rotenburg Cannibal, shocked the world in 2001 with a crime so horrifying that it defies belief. Meiwes, a seemingly ordinary computer technician from Germany, harbored dark fantasies that he eventually acted upon, forever cementing his name in criminal history. It all began when Meiwes posted an ad on a now-defunct internet forum called The Cannibal Cafe, searching for a willing participant who wanted to be eaten. Incredibly, he found a respondent, Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin. On March 9, 2001, Brandes traveled to Meiwes' home in Rotenburg, Germany, fully aware of the fate that awaited him. After meeting at Meiwes' farmhouse, the two engaged in sexual acts before Meiwes severed Brandes' penis, which they attempted to cook and eat together. However, the horror did not stop there.
In March 2001, he killed a man and ate him, along with a glass of fine red wine.
Brandes, severely injured and bleeding profusely, agreed to be killed. Meiwes then stabbed him in the throat, ending his life. What followed was a gruesome series of events. Meiwes dismembered Brandes' body, storing various parts in his freezer and consuming them over several months. He meticulously documented the entire process on video, which later became key evidence during his trial.
Armin Meiwes was a sexual sadist who found cannibalism the means by which he could express.
In total, Meiwes admitted to consuming around 44 pounds of Brandes' flesh, even serving it with side dishes like potatoes and a pepper or wine sauce. Meiwes was arrested in December 2002 after another potential victim alerted the authorities. Initially convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison, his case was later retried. In 2006, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court ruled that despite Brandis's consent, the act was morally reprehensible and constituted murder.
Nein, ich muss pinkeln und ist dann aufgestanden und dann eben zusammengebrochen.
Number 14. Albert Fish. Born Hamilton, Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., Albert Fish would later become known by many chilling names: the Brooklyn Vampire, the Gray Man, and most notoriously, a cannibal. Fish's descent into madness began early in his life, marked by severe mental illness and disturbing behaviors. By 1919, his fixation on pain, torture, and cannibalism had fully taken root. He targeted vulnerable children, often those who were intellectually disabled or from marginalized communities, believing they wouldn't be missed. Fish believed he was following divine instructions, hearing voices that told him to carry out these horrific acts. His most infamous crime occurred in 1928 when he abducted 10-year-old Grace Budd under the guise of taking her to a birthday party. Instead, he took her to an isolated house where he brutally murdered and dismembered her. In a chilling letter sent to Grace's mother years later, Fish detailed how he cooked and ate parts of the young girl's body, showing no remorse. Fish's crimes were eventually uncovered, leading to his arrest in 1934. He confessed to the murders of several children, though only 3 could be definitively linked to him. During his trial, Fish pleaded insanity, claiming that God had commanded him to kill. However, the court found him sane enough to stand trial, and he was sentenced to death. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison. Number 13. Isekai Sagawa. Isekai Sagawa, a man born in 1949 in Kobe, Japan, carried out an act in 1981 that would shock the world. While studying at the Sorbonne in Paris, Sagawa invited his Dutch classmate, René Hardevelt, to his apartment under the guise of academic collaboration. Once there, as she read poetry aloud, Sagawa shot her in the neck with a rifle, killing her instantly. Driven by a long-standing obsession, Sagawa's actions after the murder were beyond disturbing. He proceeded to rape her lifeless body and then began to consume parts of her flesh. He described the taste and sensation as a fulfillment of his darkest fantasies, admitting later that he had always dreamed of eating human flesh. Sagawa's attempt to dispose of Hartveldt's remains was thwarted when he was caught trying to dump her dismembered body in suitcases at a public park. Arrested by French police, Sagawa confessed immediately, stating that he had killed her specifically to eat her flesh. However, instead of facing justice, he was declared legally insane by a French judge, avoiding prison, and being deported back to Japan. In Japan, Sagawa was deemed sane by Japanese psychologists, but due to legal loopholes and the sealed French court documents, he was never prosecuted. Remarkably, Sagawa was released from the psychiatric hospital in 1986 and became a minor celebrity. He wrote books about his experience, appeared in films, and even participated in talk shows, exploiting his notoriety. Sagawa lived freely until his death from pneumonia in 2002, at the age of 73. Number 12. Richard Chase. Richard Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento, unleashed a reign of terror over a mere month between December 1977 and January 1978. Born in 1950, Chase grew up under the shadow of mental illness, which ultimately drove him to commit horrific acts. Chase's obsession with blood began early in his life, rooted in delusions that Nazis were trying to turn his blood into powder. He believed that by drinking the blood of others, he could prevent this from happening. This twisted belief system fueled his gruesome killing spree. His first known victim was 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, who was shot in a drive-by shooting on December 29, 1977. This killing ignited a chain of events that would see Chase break into homes, not just to murder, but to fulfill his macabre rituals. On January 23, 1978, Chase entered the home of Teresa Wallen, a pregnant woman, and brutally murdered her, drinking her blood and desecrating her body. Less than a week later, on January 27, 1978, Chase committed his most infamous crime. He entered the home of Evelyn Miroth, where he killed her. her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and a neighbor, Dan Meredith. Chase drained their blood and consumed parts of their bodies, leaving behind a horrifying scene that would lead to his eventual capture. The police arrested Chase shortly after this killing spree, finding overwhelming evidence in his apartment, including body parts of his victims. He was sentenced to death, but before his execution could be carried out, Chase took his own life in December 1980 by overdosing on medication. Number 11. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, infamously known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who terrorized the Soviet Union from 1978 to 1990. Born in 1936 in Ukraine, Chikatilo's early life was marred by poverty, bullying, and sexual dysfunction, which later contributed to his gruesome crimes. Chikatilo began his killing spree in 1978 with the murder of 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova. Over the next 12 years, he would go on to kill at least 53 people. His victims were often young girls, boys, and women whom he lured from bus stops and train stations. He would lead them into isolated areas where he would stab them repeatedly, often disemboweling them. In a particularly disturbing detail, Chikatilo confessed to eating parts of his victims, including their sexual organs, which he claimed gave him sexual gratification.
We were trying to play on the criminal's emotions and drive him into an isolated location.
The Soviet police were initially baffled by the series of brutal killings, as serial murders were virtually unheard of in the USSR. It wasn't until the late 1980s that they began to piece together the pattern and realized they were dealing with a single perpetrator. Despite being arrested and released multiple times, Chikatilo managed to evade capture until November 1990. After killing his final victim, a young woman named Sveta Korostik, Chikatilo was spotted by a patrolling officer who noticed his suspicious appearance. This led to his eventual arrest. During his trial in 1992, Chikatilo confessed to the murders in chilling detail, leading investigators to previously undiscovered bodies. He was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the head, marking the end of one of the most terrifying chapters in Soviet history. Number 10. The Donner Party. Imagine embarking on a journey toward a new life, only to find yourself trapped in a snowy nightmare where survival means making the unthinkable choice. This was the grim reality for the Donner Party, a group of American pioneers who, in 1846, set out for California, only to be stranded in the Sierra Nevada mountains by one of the harshest winters on record. The Donner Party, named after its leaders George and Jacob Donner, left Springfield, Illinois in April 1846. They initially made good progress, but their decision to take the ill-fated Hastings Cutoff, a supposed shortcut, proved disastrous. This route added miles to their journey and led them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the American West. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada in late October, heavy snowfall had already begun, trapping them in the mountains. As weeks turned into months, their food supplies dwindled to nothing. The group, which originally numbered 87 men, women, and children, was forced to endure the unimaginable. With no other options left, they resorted to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of those who had already succumbed to starvation, malnutrition, and the freezing conditions. It is recorded that the first rescue party did not reach them until February 19, 1847, nearly 4 months after they were trapped. When rescuers finally arrived, they found a scene of devastation. Only 48 of the original group survived the ordeal, their stories becoming one of the most harrowing tales of survival in American history. Number 9. Alfred Packer. In the harsh winter of 1874, Alfred Packer led a group of 5 men on a treacherous journey through the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, a decision that would etch his name into the dark annals of American history. Packer, a prospector in search of gold, convinced his companions to brave the winter despite warnings from Chief Ouray, a local Ute leader who had advised them to wait until spring. Ignoring this sound advice, Packer and his group ventured into the mountains, ill-prepared for the brutal conditions that awaited them. As the days wore on, the group quickly ran out of food. Desperation set in, and according to Packer's later confessions, the men began to die off one by one. either from the cold or starvation. Packer claimed that he only resorted to cannibalism out of necessity, consuming the bodies of his deceased companions to stay alive. However, his story changed multiple times, casting doubt on his true actions. In one account, when Packer emerged from the wilderness 2 months later, he was alone, yet he appeared well-fed and carried belongings that had once belonged to his dead companions. His suspicious appearance and conflicting stories led to his arrest. After a dramatic trial, Packer was initially sentenced to death, but this was later commuted to 40 years in prison for manslaughter. Despite his grim past, Packer became something of a folk figure, even securing parole in 1901. He lived out his final years working as a guard for the Denver Post and died in 1907. Number 8. James Jameson. James Sligo Jameson, an heir to the Jameson whiskey fortune, found himself at the center of an international scandal in 1888 as part of a Belgian-led expedition into the Congo. Jameson's dark curiosity led him down a path of unimaginable horror. While stationed in the Congo, Jameson was fascinated by the stories of cannibalistic practices in the region. According to accounts, he wanted to see these gruesome acts firsthand. To satisfy this curiosity, he offered 6 handkerchiefs to a local chief in exchange for witnessing a cannibalistic ritual. This payment resulted in the procurement of a 10-year-old girl from a neighboring village. In one of the most disturbing episodes of colonial exploitation, Jameson later claimed that he thought the entire affair was a joke and did not believe the act would be carried out. However, his own writings and those of witnesses tell a chillingly different story, one in which Jameson's interest in the macabre led to the brutal death of an innocent child. Despite attempts by Jameson's widow to defend his actions, after his death from illness in August 1888, the scandal left an indelible stain on his name and the Jameson legacy. Number 7. Alexander Pierce. Imagine being so desperate that the only way to survive was to turn against your fellow escapees. This was the grim reality for Alexander Pierce, an Irish convict who became notorious in the early 19th century for his acts of cannibalism during an escape from one of Australia's most brutal penal colonies, for stealing 6 pairs of shoes. The conditions were so unbearable that Pierce, along with 7 other convicts, decided to escape into the unforgiving wilderness. Their initial plan was to steal a boat and sail to freedom, but they were forced to flee on foot. After only 8 days, starvation set in, and the group made the horrific decision to survive by cannibalizing one of their own. The first victim was Alexander Dalton, whose fate was sealed after he was killed and eaten by the remaining men. As they continued their desperate journey, one by one, the convicts turned on each other. Pierce ultimately outlived them all, killing and consuming his last companion, Robert Greenhill. Pierce was eventually captured, and when he confessed to his crimes, the authorities initially refused to believe him. However, after escaping once more and being found with the remains of his latest victim, Thomas Cox, there was no denying the truth. Pierce was convicted of murder and hanged in 1824, earning the grim title of the Cannibal Convict. Number 6. Leonardo Chian. Leonardo Chian, better known as the soap maker of Correggio, committed crimes so chilling that they have haunted Italian history since the late 1930s. Born in 1894 in Montella, Italy, Cianciulli grew up in a superstitious household. This laid the groundwork for her later beliefs in the occult. Her life was marred by tragedy and fear, especially after a fortune teller predicted that all her children would die young. This terrifying prophecy drove her to desperate measures to protect her beloved son, Giuseppe, who was drafted into the Italian army during World War II. Determined to shield her son from harm, Cianciulli concluded that the only way to ensure his safety was through human sacrifice. Over the course of 1939 and 1940, she lured 3 women to her home under the guise of helping them with personal matters. The first victim, Faustina Setti, sought help in finding a husband. Cianciulli promised her a suitor, but instead murdered her with an axe, dismembered her body, and used caustic soda to dissolve the remains. She then mixed Setti's blood into a batter to make tea cakes, which she served to neighbors, even eating them herself. Her second victim, Francesca Soavi, was deceived with the promise of a job. After drugging and killing Soavi, Cianciulli repeated the gruesome process, turning her body into soap and tea cakes. The third and final victim, Virginia Cacioppo, a former opera singer, met the same fate. Chianchuli noted that Cacioppo's flesh was particularly suitable for making creamy soap and sweeter cakes. Chianchuli's crimes were eventually uncovered when Cacioppo's sister-in-law grew suspicious of her sudden disappearance and alerted the police. When authorities found personal belongings of the victims in Chianchuli's home, she confessed to the murders in great detail. In 1946, she was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 30 years in prison, followed by 3 years in a criminal asylum. Leonardo Chianchuli died in 1970, leaving behind a legacy as one of Italy's most notorious serial killers. Number 5. Peter Bryan. Peter Bryan, a man whose name now conjures fear and horror, was born in London in 1969. His path to infamy began with a horrific crime in 1993, when he killed a young woman, Nisha Sheth, with a hammer. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Bryan was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, where he was held for 8 years before being transferred to less secure facilities due to perceived improvements in his mental state. By 2004, Bryan had been moved to an open psychiatric ward, and on February 17th of that year, he was granted a few hours of freedom. What followed was one of the most gruesome acts in British criminal history. Bryan visited the home of his friend, Brian Cherry, in Walthamstow. There, he brutally murdered Cherry, dismembering his body. When the police arrived, they found Bryan standing in the hallway, covered in blood, with a portion of Cherry's brain frying in a pan. He chillingly confessed to the officers, "I ate his brain with butter. It was really nice." Following his arrest, Bryan was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. However, his terrifying spree did not end there. On April 25, 2004, Bryan attacked and killed fellow patient Richard Loudwell, strangling him and repeatedly smashing his head against the floor. Bryan later expressed a desire to cook and eat Loudwell as well, had he not been interrupted. Peter Bryan remains incarcerated at Broadmoor Hospital, where he is expected to spend the rest of his life under strict observation. Number 4. Vince Lee. In the summer of 2008, a Greyhound bus traveling through the Canadian prairies became the scene of a nightmarish tragedy that still haunts those who were there. Vince Lee, a passenger on the bus, suddenly turned violent, attacking Tim McLean, a 22-year-old man who was sitting nearby. As the bus cruised along the highway near Portage-la-Prairie, Manitoba Lee, without any warning, began stabbing McLean repeatedly. The other passengers, shocked and terrified,
It was a blood-curdling scream, like that. Just reading my book, and all of a sudden I heard it. It was like
fled the bus while Lee continued his brutal attack. The bus driver and a few brave passengers tried to intervene, but Lee, wielding a large knife, kept them at bay. In a horrifying turn, he then decapitated McLean and displayed his severed head to the onlookers through the bus window. Lee's violence didn't end there. He began to cannibalize McLean's body, consuming parts of his flesh in front of the horrified witnesses. It took 5 grueling hours before police were able to arrest Lee, who by then had dismembered McLean's body. During his trial, it was revealed that Vince Lee suffered from untreated schizophrenia and was in the midst of a severe psychotic episode at the time of the attack. He believed that voices, which he thought were divine commands, instructed him to kill McLean, whom he perceived as a threat to the world. Lee was found not criminally responsible due to his mental illness and was sent to the Selkirk Mental Health Center for treatment. Over the following years, Lee underwent extensive psychiatric treatment and was eventually deemed stable enough to be released under strict conditions. In 2017, he was granted an absolute discharge, which meant he no longer required supervision.
The man who beheaded a fellow passenger on a Greyhound bus may soon be walking the streets of Winnipeg unsupervised.
Number 3. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the notorious Mexican drug lord, is a figure shrouded in both infamy and mystery. As the former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, his name has become synonymous with ruthless power and unimaginable violence. But there's one chilling rumor that adds an even darker shade to his already sinister reputation: cannibalism. According to cartel lore, which is often steeped in exaggeration and propaganda, Guzman may have resorted to cannibalistic acts as a terrifying form of intimidation against his enemies. These tales are whispered among those who lived in the shadow of his reign, though they remain unconfirmed and are largely considered to be part of the fearsome mythology surrounding him. Even the mere hint of such actions was enough to deepen the fear that El Chapo used to control his adversaries. Guzman's brutal legacy is marked by his ability to evade capture multiple times before his final arrest in 2016 and subsequent extradition to the United States, where he was sentenced to life in prison in 2019. Number 2. Jeffrey Dahmer. In the late 20th century, one name became synonymous with unspeakable horror: Jeffrey Dahmer. Born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer's early life showed signs of the dark path he would eventually take. His fascination with dead animals, combined with a turbulent family life, hinted at the macabre interests that would later define him. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, luring them to his apartment under the pretense of friendship or a photo shoot. Once there, he drugged, strangled, and dismembered his victims. But it was what he did after the killings that truly shocked the world. Dahmer admitted to engaging in necrophilia and cannibalism, eating parts of his victims' bodies, particularly their hearts and livers, as a way to feel a permanent connection with them. Dahmer's gruesome spree ended in July 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and flag down police. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, authorities were confronted with a scene straight out of a nightmare: severed heads in the refrigerator, human remains in the freezer, and Polaroids documenting the stages of his crimes. The media dubbed him the Milwaukee Cannibal. In 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms, amounting to 541 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. His time in prison was short-lived, however. In 1994, Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate at Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Despite his death, the legacy of his crimes continues to cast a long, dark shadow over American history. Number 1. The rugby team in the Andes. In October 1972, a chartered flight carrying 45 passengers, including members of a Uruguayan rugby team, crashed into the unforgiving terrain of the Andes Mountains. What followed is a story of survival that defies belief and has since become one of the most harrowing tales in modern history. The plane, en route from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile, struck an unnamed peak, losing its wings before crashing into a snowbank. Miraculously, 33 passengers survived the initial impact, though many were injured and all were left in a dire situation, stranded at over 11,000 feet, with no rescue in sight and only meager supplies, a few chocolate bars, tins of food, and bottles of wine. The survivors faced an unimaginable decision as days turned into weeks. As the days wore on, the reality of their situation became clear. On the 8th day, a radio broadcast confirmed their worst fears. The search for them had been called off. Faced with starvation, the survivors made a choice that would haunt them forever. They resorted to eating the flesh of those who had perished in the crash. It was an act of sheer survival, driven by the need to stay alive in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. After enduring 72 days in the mountains, their numbers dwindled to 16 due to the extreme cold, an avalanche, and the relentless struggle to survive. In a desperate bid for rescue, 2 of the survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, trekked for 10 days through the treacherous mountains before finally encountering help. Their bravery led to the rescue of the remaining survivors, who were eventually found on December 20th, 1972. The story of the Andes crash has been immortalized in the book Alive by Piers Paul Read and later adapted into a film of the same name, capturing the unimaginable horrors and the incredible resilience of those who lived through the ordeal. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.